Sometimes I open my phone for 1 second and suddenly I know too much about humanity. I know that a couple from Wisconsin is getting divorced. I know that a beauty influencer in Los Angeles cried in her car. I know that a man I have never met lost his job because of a tweet from 2016. I know what strangers ate, what strangers bought, who strangers love, who strangers hate, who strangers betrayed, who strangers unfollowed, who strangers are currently arguing with in a comment section that somehow has the emotional intensity of a medieval public execution. And living in Europe, I have to pause for a moment and ask myself a very serious question. Why do I know this much about some random family from Wisconsin? How did their kitchen renovation, their custody arrangement, and their passive-aggressive Facebook posts become part of my inner world? At some point, modern life started to feel like standing in the middle of an enormous invisible village where every window is open, every argument is audible, every tragedy is available in high definition, and every stranger arrives carrying a full emotional storyline. The strange part is how normal it feels. We wake up, touch a glowing rectangle, and within minutes our brain is asked to process a celebrity breakup, a war, a missing person case, a teenager's skincare routine, a billionaire's morning routine, a political scandal, a stranger's grief, another stranger's body transformation, and a comment from someone named Mike_742 who appears to have very strong opinions about our face. And somehow after all of this, we are expected to drink coffee, answer emails, be productive, maintain healthy relationships, regulate our nervous system, and maybe become the best version of ourselves by 9 a.m. There is something quietly absurd about this, because human beings are emotional creatures before we're intellectual ones. A face means something to us, a voice means something, a confession, a humiliation, a death, a love story, a scandal, a public rejection, a person cried into a camera at 2 a.m. All of this enters the brain through very old doors. The modern world keeps giving us strangers, and the ancient part of the mind keeps trying to treat them like the people from the village. That might be the real problem. Maybe the exhaustion many people feel today comes from the amount of work our brain does trying to care, compare, judge, remember, fear, admire, dislike, follow, interpret, and emotionally organize more human beings that any previous generation had to hold inside its mind. Maybe loneliness in the modern world feels so strange because we are surrounded by people constantly, yet very few of them actually belong to our life. Maybe social media feels overwhelming because it gives us the emotional noise of a tribe without the safety of a tribe. And maybe the human brain was built for campfires, familiar faces, repeated voices, slow trust, shared rituals, and a small circle of people whose lives were directly connected to our own. Instead, it woke up inside the internet. And somewhere inside all of this, a strange question begins to appear. Question that feels slightly ridiculous at first until you sit with it for seconds longer. How many people was a human mind actually supposed to know? Because for almost all of history, your brain only needed to understand a small group of familiar faces. Today, before breakfast, it can emotionally process more people than your ancestors encoded across entire years of their lives. Welcome, I'm Angelina, and today I want to explore a question that quietly sits underneath modern life: social media, loneliness, anxiety, celebrity culture, doom scrolling, and the strange exhaustion that follows us almost everywhere now. Why humans were never meant to know this many people. For most of human history, a person's world was small enough to remember. You were born into a circle of faces that returned every morning with the same voices, the same habits, the same private histories, and the same unbearable ability to remember something embarrassing you did years ago. This was the original human social universe. A person knew the people around them through repetition, because life kept placing the same bodies in the same landscape until every face became attached to a story. Someone was trusted because they had proven themselves their hunger. Someone was feared because their anger had a pattern. Someone was loved because their presence had become part of their weather of your life. That kind of knowledge was slow. It took seasons. It came from watching people when they were tired, useful, jealous, generous, frightened, proud, quiet, ridiculous, and occasionally so dramatic around the fire that the entire group probably wished language had remained a little less developed. Inside that world, a stranger was an event. A stranger changed the atmosphere before they said a word because the group had to decide whether this new face meant danger, opportunity, disease, marriage, conflict, or a very uncomfortable dinner where everyone smiled politely while gripping the nearest sharp object. This is the skill that shaped the human brain. Social life had ages. The mind had time to learn who mattered, who could be trusted, who carried influence, who needed help, and who had that kind of personality that made everyone quietly relieved when they walked into the opposite direction. Modern life rarely gives us that kind of context. Now a person can appear on a screen for 30 seconds, confess the worst thing that ever happened to them, make us feel something real, and disappear forever into the feed. The brain receives the emotion, yet the life around that emotion remains missing. A face arrives without a history, a scandal arrives without a village. A tragedy arrives between two unrelated pieces of content, and somehow the nervous system is expected to absorb it with the elegance of a monk and the speed of a stock trader. Earlier human communities had their own pressure, and small groups could be cruel in a very personal way because privacy becomes difficult when everyone knows your business, and your business once involved crying over someone who preferred your cousin. Still, that world matched the size of the mind. The brain could map it. The people around you belonged to the same social reality, which meant their pain, their status, their shame, and their affection had a place inside your life. Then human society began to grow beyond the original scale. The village became something larger. The familiar crowd became an anonymous crowd. The private instincts of a small group animal slowly entered cities, markets, newspapers, television, and finally the internet, where the number of visible human lives became almost absurd. And this is where the strange modern tension begins. We still react to faces with the ancient seriousness. We still treat reputation as survival. We still feel watched by people whose names we will forget in 5 minutes. We still carry a village brain. Only now, the village has no walls. This is where the story becomes strangely miserable. In the 1990s, the anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the human brain seems to have a social ceiling, a raw cognitive limit on how many stable relationships one person can maintain before the mind begins to lose the thread. The number usually attached to this idea is around 150. 150 people sounds almost laughably small now, especially in a world where someone can gain that many followers because their cat looked judgmental in good lighting. Yet the idea becomes more unsettling when you realize what Dunbar was actually describing. He was talking about real social knowledge, the kind of knowledge where a person exists inside your mind with depth, where you understand their place in the group, their relationship to others, their emotional habits, their loyalties, their grudges, and their invisible map of tension that surround them. That kind of knowledge takes mental space. A human relationship is a living file that keeps updating itself. Every person you care about carries a little folder in your brain, and inside that folder, there's history, tone, memory, application, expectation, affection, irritation, and sometimes one very specific story from 2019 that your brain keeps for legal reasons. This is part modern life hides from us. Knowing people is work. Even liking people is work. Even silently judging people from a distance, which humanity has treated as respectable private hobby for thousands of years, still takes energy. Among primates, social life appears closely tied to brain size because the more complex the group becomes, the more the mind has to track. Who is allied with whom? Who can be trusted? Who has power today? Who lost power yesterday and became dramatically weird about it? In many primate groups, grooming helps hold social bonds together because touch becomes a form of politics, affection, repair, and quiet negotiation. Humans eventually replaced much of that grooming with language, which is elegant when you call it culture and slightly embarrassing when you realize gossip may be one of civilization's oldest operating systems. Gossip sounds shallow only when we pretend humans are creatures of pure reason. In reality, gossip helped people survive because knowing who behaved badly, who shared food, who broke trust, and who created danger inside the group mattered as much as knowing where the river was. A small community runs on memory. A large society runs on systems. The problem is that our emotions still belong to the first world, while our daily lives now happen inside the second. Dunbar's number became famous because it gives shape to something many people feel without having the language for it. The human mind has limits around social intimacy, and those limits matter. You can recognize thousands of faces. You can follow thousands of accounts. You can absorb thousands of opinions. Yet stable human connection requires more than recognition because recognition is cheap and relationship is expensive. That is why modern platforms create such a strange illusion. They make us feel socially surrounded while giving the brain very little of the slow, repeated contact that turns a face into a person. You may know a creator's apartment, their dog's name, their breakup timeline, their breakfast preferences, and the exact way they cry when sitting in a parked car while they have absolutely no idea you exist. From the brain's perspective, this is deeply confusing. It looks like intimacy. It sounds like intimacy. It arrives with eye contact, voice, vulnerability, routine, and the quiet rhythm of someone becoming familiar through repetition. Yet the relationship lives mostly on one side. The ancient brain keeps building a social bond while the modern platform keeps selling the feeling of one. And then we wonder why we feel crowded and lonely at the same time. Dunbar's number also explains why the internet feels so emotionally loud. A small group gives each person a place in the map. A platform gives the mind an endless crowd of half-formed presences. Every day, we encounter people who trigger ancient social instincts without becoming part of a stable social world, and that means the brain keeps opening little emotional loops that really close. Someone is praised, someone is hated, someone disappears, someone returns with a statement filmed in soft lighting. Someone begins a public downfall, and the internet gathers around it with the spiritual seriousness of villagers watching a trial in the town square. Except the village now contains millions of people, and half of them are eating cereal while commenting on the moral collapse of civilization. This is the absurd scale of modern social life. The human mind evolved to hold a meaningful number of people with care, memory, suspicion, loyalty, and attention. The modern world asks the same mind to scan humanity as if it were an infinite room. And at some point, the room becomes too large for the old machinery inside us. The internet changed the size of human life so quickly that our emotions never had time to adapt. A village became a screen. A stranger became a daily presence. A private embarrassment became a public event. In the old human instinct for watching, the group suddenly found itself staring into a crowd with no edge. This is the part that feels almost supernatural because the internet gives us the social atmosphere of a village while removing the limits that made a village psychologically survivable. In a small community, people could watch each other with painful precision, yet their attention still had a boundary because the number of witnesses belonged to the size of the place. Online, the witness can become infinite. A joke can leave your bedroom and return as a trial. A face can become familiar to millions before that person has even understood what happened. A mistake can travel farther than any reputation was ever meant to travel, and the most absurd part is that this can happen while the person involved is sitting in sweatpants eating something over the sink thinking that day is still normal. Human reputation used to move at walking speed, that it moved through letters, then newspapers gave it machinery, then television gave it national face. The internet gave it a nervous system. Now information travels with the emotional force of gossip and the reach of empire, which is a terrible combination for a brain that still reacts to public judgment as if the tribe has gathered at the edge of the fire. This is why online attention feels so strangely physical. A person can be alone in a room and still feel surrounded. A creator can read a comment from someone they will never meet and feel it in the body before they have time to make it intellectual. The mind understands screens, but the nervous system understands eyes. This is also why the feed feels endless in a way earlier media never did. A newspaper ended, a television program ended, a conversation ended when someone had to go home. The feed behaves like a social world without sunset, where every swipe opens another human life, another emotion, another opinion, another small invitation to care about something that will vanish before the brain can place it anywhere meaningful. And because the system is built around attention, the most emotionally changed parts of a human life rise to the surface first. Humiliation rises quickly, anger rises quickly, beauty rises quickly, grief rises quickly. The calm, ordinary middle of a person's life has very little chance against a public breakdown filmed in a car with good lighting and a caption that begins with the word finally. So we ended up seeing humanity through its most exaggerated moments. We meet people at the instant of scandal, transformation, confession, collapse, victory, or outrage, which means that modern social world starts to feel more dramatic than any real village could ever be, because even the masses village had days where everyone simply repaired shoes and minded their business. The internet compresses too many emotional peaks into one ordinary afternoon. That is how a person can wake up feeling normal, open a phone, and within 10 minutes absorb enough social tension to make the nervous system feel as if it has attended 7 family arguments, 3 funerals, 1 public trial, and a very confusing wellness seminar led by someone with perfect skin. Living through this every day creates a strange kind of emotional static. The brain keeps reacting because the material looks human. The platform keeps feeding because reaction is available. And the person holding the phone sits in the middle of it all, trying to decide whether they're informed, entertained, exhausted, lonely, or simply due for a walk. The internet did something much deeper than connect people. It changed the scale at which people appear inside each other's minds. A stranger can now occupy emotional space without entering real life. A crowd can now judge without gathering in one place. A person can now become visible for beyond the natural radius of their relationships. And somewhere inside this expanded world, the ancient village brain keeps doing its old job, scanning faces for meaning, measuring status, sensing danger, and trying to understand where it belongs. Only now the village has become the size of the planet. The strangest part is that the brain knows the internet is a screen, while the body reacts as if people are actually there. This is why one comment from a stranger can change the temperature of an entire day. You can understand rationally that this person has no meaningful role in your life and still feel the sentence under your skin as if someone in the room has turned against you. This sounds dramatic until you remember that, for most of human history, social rejection carried real danger. A person who lost their protection of the group lost access to safety, food, memory, and care, so the nervous system learned to treat shame as something serious long before humans invented comment sections and profile pictures of angry men wearing sunglasses inside cars. The modern internet borrows that ancient alarm system. A like feels small, yet the body reads it as approval. A hostile comment feels stupid, yet the body reads it as threat. A sudden wave of attention feels exciting, yet the body reads it as exposure. The screen is new, but the social reflex is ancient. This is why online life can feel so intimate and so unsafe at the same time. Because every platform is built out of signals the human brain already understands. Faces looking back, voices speaking directly, groups forming around judgment, silence after vulnerability, laughter from people you cannot see. The mind tries to be modern. The nervous system remains prehistoric. And maybe that is why the internet often feels less like a tool and more like a room full of invisible people who can react to you at any moment. There's a strange humiliation in being perceived by strangers. Even when the attention is positive, it can feel like standing too close to a crowd because the body understands visibility as social risk. To be seen means to be measured. To be measured means to be placed somewhere in the group. And placement inside the group has always mattered because status is one of the oldest languages humans ever learned. This is where social media becomes especially powerful. It turns status into numbers. A person can watch approval rise and fall in real time, which is a very strange thing to give to an animal whose ancestors probably spent entire evenings analyzing one facial expression across the fire. The old brain sees numbers and turns them into belonging. It sees silence and turns it into rejection. It sees someone else being praised and immediately begins asking where it stands, as if survival still depends on knowing who receives warmth from the group and who has been quietly pushed towards the edge. That is a heavy system to carry inside a phone. This is also why public embarrassment online feels so extreme. A mistake in a small community had witnesses, but the witnesses had faces, names, memories, and some basic reason to keep living the person afterward. Online shame has a different texture. The crowd can arrive without context. It can judge without responsibility. It can leave before the emotional damage becomes visible. And the person at the center of it experiences something that looks ancient from the inside and completely modern from the outside, a social thread amplified beyond any natural scale. Even watching this happen to other people affects us. A stranger gets mocked, exposed, praised, punished, adored, and our brain quietly records the lessons. The crowd is watching, the rules are unstable, and safety depends on reading the room faster than anyone else. The problem is that the room keeps changing. There is always a new rule, a new scandal, a new moral performance, a new person being lifted up or pushed down, and the nervous system starts behaving like it lives near a village square where the trial never ends. This is why scrolling can leave a person tired, and even when they did nothing, the body has been responding. It has been scanning for danger, measuring tone, reading faces, comparing status, absorbing conflict, and preparing tiny emotional reactions to people who will vanish from consciousness by dinner. A person closes the app and feels strangely drained, as if they have spent the afternoon socializing, arguing, witnessing, judging, and being judged, while physically they have been laying in bed in the least heroic posture known to humanity. This is the hidden cost of digital social life. The internet gives ancient instincts modern volume. It takes the fear of rejection, the hunger for approval, the sensitivity to status, and the need to belong, then stretches them across an environment with almost no natural boundary. And because the brain treats social information as survival information, it keeps paying attention, even when the soul is tired, even when the body wants silence. Even when the most reasonable thing would be to put the phone down and stare at wall like a respectable 19th century person having a private crisis. Comparison used to have a human size. A person measures themselves against people who share the same weather, the same local limits, the same illness, the same food, the same rumors, and rarely the same impossible neighbor who somehow made everyone feel behind in life before capitalists got involved. That kind of comparison could still hurt. A village could make a person feel poor, unattractive, unsuccessful, unwanted, or painfully average because human beings have always been talented at turning ordinary existence into a small psychological competition. But the scale was local. Your mind was comparing itself to people who lived inside the same reality. Today, comparison has become global. A person can wake up in a small apartment, still half asleep, holding a cup of coffee that tastes like regret, and immediately compare their body to a fitness creator with professional lighting, their career to a founder who became rich at 22, their face to someone edited by genetics, money, and an algorithm that has learned exactly which insecurity keeps the thumb moving. The brain sees these people as social information. It rarely pauses to calculate the machinery around the image. It responds first, explains later, and by the time reason arrives, the body has already received the message that somewhere out there, inside the same human world, everyone is more beautiful, more disciplined, more desired, more successful, more calm, and somehow also making sourdough while invested in real estate. This is a very strange emotional environment. A medieval peasant could feel jealous of the person with the better cow, which sounds humble until you remember that cow was basically a bank account with legs. Now we can feel inadequate because a stranger on another continent bought a house at 19, has visible abs in February, speaks 5 languages, wakes up at 5 in the morning and records it all in a kitchen that looks like God personally approved the marble. The comparison has lost its natural boundary. The mind keeps measuring itself against life that were selected, polished, framed, monetized, and developed at the exact moment when we are least defended against them. And because these images arrive through faces and voices, they feel socially real. The person on screen becomes part of the mental crowd, even if their life has almost no connection to ours. We begin to feel watched by standards that have no body. Beauty becomes a crowd. Successful becomes a crowd. Youth becomes a crowd. Productivity becomes a crowd. And happiness becomes something that appears to be happening elsewhere, usually in better lighting. This is why modern ambition often feels anxious rather than inspiring. The old human desire for status once operated inside a recognizable social field where being respected meant something practical inside the group. Now status has become almost abstract. A person can be loved by people nearby and still feel inaccessible because the wider digital world has shown them as thousands lives that seem larger. A person can be healthy and still feel behind because the screen has created a version of the human body that behaves more like a commercial object than a living organism. A person can be talented and still feel ordinary because the internet gathers the most exceptional people on earth into one endless corridor and asks the rest of us to walk through it before breakfast. Of course, the nervous system becomes tired. It is trying to find its place in a hierarchy that has no final shape. There is always someone above. There's always someone younger. There's always someone richer. There's always someone who appears to have solved life while you're trying to remember whether you paid the electricity bill. And because the algorithm often rewards intensity, the people who appear in front of us tend to represent extremes while ordinary human life quietly disappears from view. The average person becomes invisible. The normal body becomes invisible. The slow career becomes invisible. The private struggle becomes invisible. And when ordinary life disappears from the public mirror, ordinary people begin to feel as if they are failing at being human. This might be one of the most painful effects of knowing too many people. We lose the ability to understand ourselves through a stable community, so we borrow standards from strangers, celebrities, creators, millionaires, and carefully edited lives that were never meant to become the measuring stick for our own. The village brain wants to know where it stands. The internet answers with the entire species. And somehow, we are surprised when the answer makes us feel small. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from knowing too much about people whose lives will never touch yours. It feels different from ordinary fatigue because the body has been still, the room has been quiet, and yet the mind feels as if it has traveled through several crises by noon. You read about someone's grave while brushing your teeth. You've seen a family lose everything while waiting for coffee. You watch a stranger explain the worst day of their life with the casual intimacy of a voice message, and then 1 second later, the screen offers something cheerful, as if the nervous system can change emotional climate with the emergence of weather app. The modern feed asks the brain to do something very unnatural. It asks us to care without contact. It asks us to witness without presence. It asks us to feel without any meaningful way to respond. The last part matters because human empathy involved inside situations where emotion usually had somewhere to go. If someone in the group was hurt, you could bring water, sit nearby, hold a hand, share food, take over a task, or simply become another body in the same space. Which sounds small until you realize how much of human comfort has always depended on the quiet fact of being physically there. Online compassion often has no place to land. A tragedy appears, opens something in the chest, and leaves the viewer with a feeling that is too large for the tiny action available to them. Maybe they press a heart, maybe they share a post. Maybe they sit there with the strange guilt of being safe while another person's world is burned on a screen the size of a hand. This is one reason doomscrolling feels so corrosive. The brain keeps receiving signals of danger from places it cannot enter. The body prepares for a world that needs action, while the actual person remains in bed wrapped in a blanket and becomes politically aware and spiritually unwell at the same time. There is a dark comedy in that image because modern humans can now experience the emotional pressure of global catastrophe while looking like an abandoned croissant under a duvet. Earlier humans also lived with danger, grief, and uncertainty, yet their suffering usually belonged to a social world the mind could locate. Pain had a geography, fear had a direction. Loss had a name that people around you also knew. Today, much of our fear arrives abstractly, through headlines, clips, arguments, testimonies, images, statistics, and voices from people who become vivid for a moment and then dissolve into the next piece of information. The brain tries to make all of it human. That is its job. It turns faces into meaning, voices into presence, stories into emotional obligations, and suddenly the inner world becomes crowded with strangers who are real enough to affect us and distant enough to remain unreachable. This creates a strange form of helpless intimacy. We know details about people we will never protect. We feel concerned for lives we will never influence. We carry fragments of other people's pain without the communal rituals that once helped humans digest sorrow together. That may be why the modern person often feels emotionally full and socially empty at the same time. The mind has consumed human life all day. The heart has touched almost nobody. And because the feed has no natural ending, the brain rarely receives the old signal that the day's social world is complete. A village settles at night. A conversation ends because the bodies get tired and darkness changes the rules. The internet keeps glowing. Somewhere someone is always confessing, collapsing, winning, disappearing, returning, grieving, apologizing, being misunderstood, being praised, being hated, and the mind, built to treat human information as important, keeps leaning toward the light. At some point, the question becomes less about why we feel overwhelmed and more about how we could feel anything else. A brain shaped for a small circle now carries the emotional weather of the planet. And every day, it tries to turn an endless crowd of strangers into something it can't understand. The stranger's kind of modern intimacy is the kind that happens entirely on one side. You hear someone's voice for months, maybe years, and slowly their presence begins to feel familiar in a way that surprises you. Because they have become part of your evenings, your walks, your meals, your background noise, your small private rituals of existing. A creator can become associated with a particular season of your life. A podcast host can feel connected to a room they have never entered. A YouTuber can start to feel like someone who was there during a difficult year, even though their only real act was uploading a video at the exact moment your life needed a voice in the background. This is the emotional logic of parasocial relationships. The term sounds clinical, almost cold, yet the experience itself can feel warm and deeply human because the brain learns people through repetition, and repetition has always been one of the foundations of closeness. The old mind sees the same face again and again, hears the same rhythm of speech, receives private stories, learns tiny habits, and begins to build a sense of recognition. In a village, that recognition would usually be mutual. Online, it can remain beautifully one-sided and slightly insane. A person can know the layout of a stranger's kitchen, the name of their dog, the tone they use when they are tired, the way they laugh, when they are avoiding sadness and still be represented to that person by nothing more than a number under video. There is something very tender about this and also something faintly absurd. Humanity invented agriculture, cities, printed presses, satellites, and eventually reached the point where a lonely person can feel emotionally supported by a man in another country who reviews microphones with the seriousness of a medieval scholar preserving sacred manuscripts. And honestly, sometimes that helps. Parasocial bonds can give comfort, routine, inspiration, humor, companionship, and a strange sense that someone familiar is nearby when ordinary life feels thin. This is why people become attached to creators during periods of loneliness or transition, because the voice returns, the format returns, the face returns, and the mind receives the soothing illusion of continuity. Danger appears when this substitute begins to carry the emotional weight of a real social world. A screen can offer familiarity while the body still longs for presence. A creator can't speak with intimacy while the viewer remains unseen. A community can gather around a figure while each person still sits alone with headphones, receiving belonging through glass. This creates a peculiar modern ache because the brain gets the signals of connection while the deeper human need for reciprocal recognition remains hungry. We can feel close to people who cannot recognize us in a crowd. We can meet someone who has no memory of us. We can feel betrayed by a stranger's choices because our mind quietly placed them in a social role they never agreed to occupy. This is why online disappointment can feel so personal. When a creator changes, disappears, lies, burns out, becomes famous, sells something strange, joins a scandal, or simply stops feeling like the person we imagined, the reaction can carry the emotional tone of losing someone from the village. Of course, from the outside, this looks irrational. From the inside, it makes a strange kind of sense. The brain bonded through exposure. The platform encouraged the bond. The creator performed intimacy because intimacy holds attention. The viewer responded with trust because trust is what humans do when a voice becomes familiar enough. Everyone participated in a social ritual that ancient biology can understand and modern technology can monetize. And here we return to the central problem. The human mind was built for relationships that unfold within a shared reality, where knowing someone also meant being known by them, where presence carried responsibility, and where intimacy grew through a life that touched yours in return. Now intimacy can be streamed, familiarity can be scheduled, affection can be scaled to millions. A person can sit in a bedroom, speak into a camera, and become part of the emotional architecture of strangers across the planet. That is beautiful in one sense because it means comfort can travel farther than ever before. It is unsettling in another sense because the brain may accept the feeling of connection while the body continues to wait for the real thing. So the modern person ends up in a strange social condition, surrounded by familiar voices, emotionally attached to distant faces, comforted by people who will never know their name, and still quietly wondering why the room feels empty after the video ends. The final paradox is that modern life surrounds us with human presence while making actual connection feel strangely rare. We see more faces than any generation before us, hear more opinions, absorb more private stories, witness more public emotions, and still return to rooms where the deepest parts of our lives remain known by very few people. That is the strange loneliness of the internet age. It gives the brain the sensation of a crowd and gives the heart very little of the safety that a real human circle provides. A person can spend the entire day inside human noise and still end the evening craving one quiet conversation with someone who knows how their face changes when they are tired. Maybe this is why modern loneliness feels so confusing. It rarely looks like isolation from the outside. It often looks like being reachable, visible, entertained, informed, and surrounded by constant signals of life. Yet somewhere underneath all of that movement, the old human need remains almost embarrassingly simple. We want to be known in a way that has weight. We want our presence to matter somewhere beyond performance. We want relationships that survive silence, bad moods, ordinary days, and the deeply unglamorous human moments that would get very poor engagement online. The internet can show us humanity at a scale that feels almost divine, but the nervous system still asks for something smaller, a familiar room, a repeated voices, a person who remembers the version of you that existed before the latest reinvention. A life where the people who enter your mind also have some claim on your actual world. Maybe the problem is that we confuse exposure with closeness. We see a person often enough and begin to feel near them. We are seen often enough and begin to feel understood, but human connection has always required more than visibility, because being perceived by many people can still leave the most important part of a person untouched. This does not make modern life hopeless. It makes it strange. It means we are living through a social experience so large that nobody truly consented to it. A world where ancient emotional instincts are being tested inside technological structures that grew faster than culture could interpret them. The mind still wants the village. The world keeps offering the planet. And somewhere between those two scales, we're trying to build a life that feels human. So maybe the answer is not to disappear from modern life, because the modern life is where we are, with all its absurdity, brilliance, cruelty, humor, tenderness, and the occasional stranger from Wisconsin whose divorce somehow becomes emotionally relevant to a person in Eastern Europe. Maybe the answer begins with noticing the scale. Noticing when the mind is carrying too many strangers. Noticing when comparison has become planetary. Noticing when empathy has turned into helplessness. Noticing when a familiar voice through a screen has replaced the risk of being known by someone nearby. Because the human brain can imagine the world, but the human heart still needs a place. And maybe that place has always been smaller than the internet told us it should be. Anyway, that's what I found when I started asking why humans were never meant to know this many people.